The wind whispered through the pine-covered hills as the last light of day slipped beneath the Mogollon Rim. In the remote forests of northeastern Arizona, a battered pickup truck rumbled down a logging road, its headlights slicing through the encroaching dusk. Inside sat 7 men, their clothes dusted with sawdust and sweat, the fatigue of a long workday setting into their limbs. The truck jostled and creaked over the uneven terrain, the men joking, teasing, just trying to get home. Travis Walton sat near the front, 22 years old and full of restless energy. He was wiry and dark-haired, with the sharp features of someone who rarely sat still. Logging was hard work, but it gave him something to push against, something that made sense in a way the rest of life often didn't. His friend and boss, Mike Rogers, sat behind the wheel, focused on the winding trail ahead. The others, Dwayne Smith, Ken Peterson, Steve Pierce, John Goulet, and Alan Dalis, chattered behind them, laughing louder than the growl of the engine. Then, something changed. A glow pierced the forest ahead, soft at first, then brightening, unnatural in color and shape. It wasn't the moon. It wasn't a fire. It hovered, pulsing with an inner life, just above the clearing they were approaching. The conversation died. Mike eased off the gas. The forest fell into eerie silence, and a low hum vibrated through the air, the kind that you feel in your bones before you hear with your ears. They rolled into the clearing and froze. Suspended in the air ahead of them, no more than 100 feet away, was a glowing disc-shaped object, about 15 feet high and 30 feet across. It emitted a golden light tinged with electric blue, shimmering as if wrapped in a thin film of heat. The air seemed charged, thick. It floated silently, yet every man in that truck could feel its presence pushing against their minds. Travis didn't hesitate. Without a word, he threw open the passenger door and stepped out onto the forest floor. The others shouted, sharp, panicked cries, but Travis didn't turn back. Something deeper than curiosity pulled at him, something primal and urgent. He walked toward the object, boots crunching softly over pine needles, eyes fixed on the radiant craft. The hum in the air intensified, rising into a high-pitched whine that made his skin crawl. Yet he kept moving. The light seemed to shimmer more brightly as he approached. He paused beneath it, no more than 20 feet away, and stared up into the metallic underbelly. His breath caught in his throat. The air was thick and ionized, crackling against his skin. Then, without warning, a beam of bluish-green light shot out from the underside and struck him square in the chest. It was like being hit by lightning and water all at once. His body arched violently, his limbs flailed, suspended in midair. The other men watched in horror as Travis was thrown backward, arms splayed, crashing hard to the ground. He didn't move. Panic exploded in the truck. Mike slammed his foot on the gas, tires spinning wildly before catching traction. The truck tore out of the clearing, weaving through trees, branches whipping against the sides. They didn't speak, couldn't speak. Their minds reeled, their bodies running on instinct and terror. The thing they had seen wasn't supposed to exist, and it had just struck down their friend like he was nothing. They drove for what felt like forever before finally stopping. Breathless, pale, they argued. Should they go back? What if the object was still there? What if it came for them next? But guilt pressed heavier than fear. and finally they turned the truck around. They returned to the clearing. It was empty. No light, no craft, no sound but the rustling of trees and their own footsteps. Travis was gone. They searched frantically, shouting his name into the woods, hoping he'd stumble out of the dark with some wild story and a laugh. But the clearing was quiet, cold, and still. Flashlights cut pale circles into the underbrush, revealing only shadows. There were no footprints beyond their own, no signs of a struggle, no scorch marks or debris. It was as if Travis had been plucked from the earth, leaving no trace behind. Eventually, the cold seeped into their bones, and dread turned into silent despair. They returned to town, eyes hollow, unsure how to explain what had happened. At the sheriff's office, Mike Rogers made the call. He told the deputy everything, about the craft, the light, the beam that took Travis. The deputy, Chuck Ellison, listened with furrowed brows and a thin veil of skepticism. It sounded like the plot of a low-budget movie. Still, he followed protocol. By morning, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie had joined the case. Search teams were organized. Helicopters were brought in. Volunteers with dogs combed the woods. They searched for 2 full days, methodically covering every inch of forest around the site. But there was nothing. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a footprint. Not a drop of blood. Just pine needles, dirt, and silence. Then the tide of public opinion began to shift. Rumors flew through Snowflake. Some said the loggers had made it all up, that it was a hoax to cover something darker. Murder, maybe. An accident gone wrong. Others said Travis had simply run off, seeking attention or escaping responsibility. The sheriff's department began to lean toward foul play. It was easier to believe that a man had been killed than abducted by something from the stars. The pressure mounted. Mike and the rest of the crew were questioned again and again. Every man stuck to the same story, down to the smallest detail. The fear in their eyes was real. The trembling in their voices wasn't performance. But still, suspicion lingered like smoke. Then, 5 days after Travis had vanished, everything changed. On the night of November 10th, a phone rang at the home of Travis Walton's brother Grant. The voice on the other end was weak, ragged, barely more than a whisper. It was Travis. Disoriented, dehydrated, and confused, he said he was at a gas station in the nearby town of Heber, miles away from where he'd disappeared. Grant and his family raced there, finding him curled up near a payphone, trembling, filthy, and terrified. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His beard had grown out. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty. His eyes darted nervously at every sound. When they reached for him, he flinched, like someone who'd been living in a nightmare. The authorities were notified immediately. Reporters swarmed. But Travis wasn't ready to talk. He seemed dazed, shell-shocked, as though part of him hadn't fully returned. He would later describe waking up in the woods, cold and confused, staring up at a bright light as the craft silently lifted into the sky and disappeared. At first, no one believed him. He was taken for medical evaluation, both physical and psychological. Tests revealed mild dehydration, signs of exhaustion, and a handful of surface bruises, but no evidence of trauma, drug use, or injury. He was coherent. His memory of the missing days, however, was hazy. Fragments came in flashes, bright lights, sterile rooms, tall figures moving in silence. As Travis rested and slowly regained his composure, he began to talk. What he remembered chilled those who listened. He spoke of regaining consciousness in a small, rounded room. The walls were metallic, dimly lit, and curved inward like the inside of a capsule. The air was dense, thick with something he couldn't describe. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, paralyzed. Above him hovered strange instruments, intricate, delicate, and unlike anything he had ever seen. And then the figures appeared. They were small, no more than 5 feet tall, with pale, hairless skin and large, dark eyes that took up much of their faces. Their heads were slightly too large for their slender frames, and they moved with a calm precision that made Travis's skin crawl. They didn't speak, not with words, but he could feel something, a presence, a pressure in his mind, as if they were communicating silently, beyond language. He panicked. His body surged with adrenaline, and suddenly he was able to move. He sprang off the table, stumbling backward, knocking into the walls. The figures didn't react aggressively. They simply watched, heads tilting slightly as if studying him. Travis grabbed what looked like a metal rod from a nearby shelf and swung it wildly, trying to keep them at bay. The beings retreated, slipping through a doorway and disappearing into the corridor beyond. Alone, Travis darted into the hallway. The passage was narrow, dimly lit, and the air still carried that strange, heavy quality. He ran down it, searching for an exit, his footsteps echoing against the curved metal floor. Doors lined the corridor, some open, revealing unfamiliar instruments and glowing panels. The whole place seemed alive, humming with energy, responding subtly to his presence. Eventually, he entered a large domed chamber with a central chair facing a curved window. The chair looked strangely organic, molded to the shape of a human body, with smooth surfaces and no visible seams. He approached it cautiously, drawn to the view beyond the window. A dazzling display of stars and cosmic dust, like nothing he'd ever seen from Earth. As he reached out to touch the controls, another figure entered. This one looked human. He froze, staring at the newcomer. This figure was taller, with blonde hair and smooth tanned skin. It wore a tight-fitting blue uniform that shimmered faintly in the ambient light. The man didn't speak either, but he smiled, calm, reassuring, and gestured for Travis to follow. Exhausted, confused, and desperate for answers, Travis obeyed. The man led him through another corridor, one that sloped downward and widened as they walked. The strange hum of the craft continued, ever present, but oddly soothing now. They passed through a large circular doorway into what appeared to be a hangar. Travis caught a glimpse of several other craft, sleek, domed, resting silently on the smooth floor. The air here felt lighter, more breathable. Another door slid open silently and they stepped into a new room. There, more beings awaited him. They were like the first man, human in appearance, yet subtly off. Their features were too perfect, too symmetrical. They all wore the same form-fitting suits, their expressions calm and serene. Travis tried to speak, to ask where he was, what they wanted, but no sound escaped his dry throat. He gestured wildly, the panic returning to his eyes. The blond man gently guided him to a table. It looked like an examination bench, though far more advanced, smooth, glowing softly around the edges. Before he could resist, the others helped him lie down. They moved with coordinated grace, not rough, but not asking permission either. A mask descended toward his face. It looked like a clear plastic oval filled with swirling mist. He struggled, weakly trying to push it away, but a strange heaviness overcame him. Darkness folded in from the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw was the glowing ceiling above him, breathing with soft pulses of light, as if it were alive and watching. When he awoke, he was lying face down on cold, damp ground. Pine needles pressed into his cheek. The scent of earth and bark filled his lungs. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, a surreal hallucination. But as he pushed himself upright, shivering and disoriented, he realized he was in the middle of the forest. The sky above was black, scattered with stars. A chill hung in the air. Then he looked up. A light, soft, white, and silent, hovered in the sky above him. It pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then shot upward into the darkness with impossible speed. Gone, just like that. He staggered to his feet, limbs aching. He had no idea how long he'd been gone. His mouth was dry, his throat sore. His mind swam with images he didn't understand. The beings, the ship, the strange feeling of floating, of being studied. Every sound in the forest made him flinch. He was afraid they might come back. Or worse, that no one would believe a word he said. Somehow, he found a nearby road. He walked for what felt like hours, feet dragging, until he spotted the lights of a gas station in the distance. A payphone stood near the front, flickering in the fluorescent glow. He stumbled to it, barely able to think. There was only one number he could remember. He dialed. When his brother answered, Travis could hardly speak. The words were dry in his mouth, and tears came before he could explain. But his voice was real. He was alive. And in that moment, everything changed. Word spread quickly. Reporters descended on the small town of Snowflake. Some called it a miracle. Others cried hoax. The police were baffled. The loggers were vindicated. But now, everyone wanted to know what had happened to Travis Walton. As Travis recovered, both physically and emotionally, investigators began to dig deeper. Skeptics challenged every detail. Was it possible that he had hallucinated the whole thing? Could he have been hiding in the woods for 5 days? But the terrain had been searched extensively, and Travis showed no signs of prolonged exposure to the cold nights or the rough wilderness. His beard growth matched the length of time he was missing. There were no injuries that indicated a fall or attack, just small marks and a lingering, haunted look in his eyes. The real turning point came with the polygraph tests. Mike Rogers and the crew were asked to submit to lie detector exams. Though crude by today's standards, these tests were taken seriously at the time. 6 of the 7 passed, with results indicating they were telling the truth about witnessing a UFO and seeing Travis struck by a beam of light. One test was considered inconclusive, not a failure, but not a clean pass. Still, it was enough for many to start reconsidering. If they weren't lying, then what had they seen? Meanwhile, Travis began giving interviews, slowly piecing together fragments of what he had experienced. He never claimed to fully understand it. In fact, he admitted that parts of his memory were still foggy, distorted by fear, by trauma, or perhaps by the experience itself. But he remained consistent in his account. The light, the paralysis, the strange beings, and the overwhelming sense that he had been taken far from Earth, examined, and returned. He didn't want fame. In fact, Travis recoiled from it. He avoided the spotlight as much as possible, wary of those who sought to profit off his story. Yet the media circus continued to grow. Some saw him as a hero, others mocked him. The incident became one of the most scrutinized and documented abduction cases in history, sparking debates in scientific circles, UFO communities, and among average people everywhere. The experience fractured Travis's life in ways that couldn't be measured in interviews or headlines. While some in the community rallied around him, others whispered behind closed doors. A few friends kept their distance, unsure what to believe. He found himself living in two worlds, one rooted in the quiet routines of a logging town, and another, woven from cosmic threads far beyond human comprehension. He tried to return to normal life, but it never truly returned. Nightmares plagued him. He'd jolt awake in cold sweats, convinced he was back inside that ship under those sterile lights. Sometimes he'd wake up gasping for breath, reaching for a face that wasn't there. A face with wide black eyes and skin like porcelain. The fear never fully left. Even in daylight, he felt watched, like a part of him was still tethered to something beyond the sky. Despite the trauma, Travis refused to recant. He knew what he had seen. He knew what had been done to him. And though he couldn't explain every detail or silence every skeptic, he stood firm. Not for attention, not for money, but because it was the truth as he had lived it. The emotional toll of holding on to that truth, especially in the face of ridicule, was immense. But letting it go would have been worse. Over time, he found strength in speaking out. He began to attend conferences, telling his story not to persuade, but to offer what he knew, what he remembered. He met others who had experienced similar events, people who, like him, bore invisible scars. In their company, he found a strange kind of peace, a shared understanding that whatever had happened to him wasn't unique, and that humanity might not be alone after all. Years passed, but the questions never stopped. Investigators revisited the site in the forest again and again. Soil samples were taken, electromagnetic readings measured, and atmospheric anomalies explored. Some researchers reported elevated radiation levels at the spot where Travis had been struck. Others noted unusual tree growth in a radial pattern around the clearing, as though the very biology of the forest had been altered by the presence of the craft. Skeptics continued to push back. They proposed alternative theories: mass hallucination, group hysteria, a cleverly orchestrated hoax. But none of those explanations accounted for the raw emotion in the loggers' voices, the polygraph results, or the physical evidence left behind. None could explain the sheer terror etched into Travis's face the night he was found. Hollywood eventually took notice. In 1993, a film adaptation of Travis's story was released, Fire in the Sky. Though based on real events, the filmmakers took creative liberties, especially with the scenes aboard the craft. The actual experiences, Travis later said, were far more clinical, sterile, and quiet, not the grotesque horror depicted on screen. Still, the film reignited interest in the case, bringing his story to a new generation. Despite the attention, Travis remained grounded. He never claimed to have all the answers. He never claimed to be special. He was a man who had gone into the forest with his crew one evening and emerged 5 days later, forever changed. His story wasn't meant to convert the world, only to share what had happened to him, what had happened beyond the veil of stars. In that strange place no one could quite name. He often spoke of the silence that followed, not just from the world around him, but from the experience itself. There had been no grand revelation, no booming voices, no clear message from the sky, just observation, study, a chilling sense that something out there had taken notice and was watching still. As time stretched on, the memory of that November night never faded. It clung to Travis like a shadow, always close, always just beneath the surface. Sometimes he'd be going about his day, shopping, driving, talking with friends, and a flicker would return. The glint of a light too white, the hum of a machine too quiet. The sense that space itself had bent around him and then released him like a snapped tether. People asked if he wished it hadn't happened, and sometimes he admitted he did. Life had been simpler before. He missed the days when his biggest concern was whether the crew would meet their logging contract. He missed laughing without the weight of cosmic fear behind his eyes. But other times, he acknowledged something deeper. That maybe, just maybe, he had seen a sliver of something meant to wake us up. Not everything he remembered was terrifying. There had been awe, wonder, a beauty in the stars beyond that ship's window that no photo could capture. A moment of absolute stillness where Earth felt like a distant memory and the infinite stretched in every direction. In that instant, even fear had dissolved, replaced by a quiet understanding. We are small, but we are being noticed. Years later, he would revisit the forest. He walked to the clearing alone, the air thick with pine and memory. The trees had grown, taller now, but the spot still pulsed with something unseen. He stood there in silence, listening, not for sounds, but for the feeling, that electric pressure in the chest, the shift in gravity that had marked the beginning of it all. It wasn't there anymore. Or maybe it was, waiting just beyond the veil, in the place where stars are born and stories are swallowed. Travis often reflected on how the experience had shifted his understanding of the universe and of himself. Before that night, his world had been grounded in the physical, in the tangible. The feel of bark under his fingers, the weight of an axe, the rhythm of hard labor. Afterward, nothing felt fully real in the same way. There was always a lingering suspicion that the world he saw was only a surface layer, and something deeper, stranger, hummed just beneath it. People from all walks of life reached out to him. Some wanted to hear his story firsthand. Others came with their own experiences, quietly sharing things they'd never told anyone before. Patterns began to emerge. Missing time, lights in the sky, inexplicable sensations of floating or paralysis. He listened. He offered what little guidance he could. And in doing so, he realized that his story was just one node in a vast, tangled network of encounters. There were those who accused him of lying, of seeking fame. But Travis never lived like someone chasing a spotlight. He wasn't flashy. He didn't tour the world trying to monetize his experience. Instead, he remained in Arizona, close to his roots, doing what he could to rebuild a quiet life. He kept working. He stayed close to family, and he kept telling his story. Not because he needed to, but because others needed to hear it. In the years that followed, the scientific community stayed largely silent. Ufology gained momentum, but mainstream science hesitated to engage. Still, Travis's case remained one of the most thoroughly investigated incidents in abduction lore. Dozens of books cited it, conferences studied it, and each retelling came with the same solemn thread. Something happened in those woods, something that left a man forever changed. There were moments, late at night, when Travis would lie awake and let his mind drift back to the ship, to the sterile walls, the humming silence, the strange eyes that studied him without blinking. He tried to make sense of it all, to decode what the beings had wanted. Was he chosen at random? Was it an accident, a study, or something more? No answers ever came, only the memory of those silent stares and the weight of being utterly powerless. Still, there had been something almost reverent in the way the beings moved. They hadn't harmed him, not deliberately. There had been no surgical tools, no torture, only observation and a peculiar kind of detachment, like entomologists studying an insect that had landed unexpectedly on their microscope slide. Cold, clinical, and yet not cruel. That absence of emotion had been the most unsettling part. Not malice, but indifference. And then there was the moment he saw the stars. He remembered it with painful clarity. The vast window had stretched across the wall like a painting come alive. Stars wheeled across it in slow, majestic arcs, their light crisp and ancient. It had struck him then how utterly tiny he was. How everything he'd ever known, every friend, every town, every comfort, existed on a pale dot of dust now hidden from view. That perspective had never left him. He didn't need to convince others. The truth of his experience had carved itself into his bones, not just his memory. And as he grew older, he began to accept that not everyone would believe him. That was okay. The experience wasn't for them. It was his. Strange, traumatic, beautiful, and he had lived it. That was all that mattered. Every so often, someone would find their way to Snowflake and ask for him. A journalist, a documentary crew, a curious traveler with more questions than answers. Travis would meet them if the mood was right and talk. Not with spectacle or drama, but with the quiet cadence of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time. He'd take them to the woods. They'd walk beneath the towering pines, the needles crunching softly beneath their boots. The air was clean there, almost sacred. Travis would pause at the clearing, the very spot where his life had split in two, and let the silence speak. The visitors always listened differently in that place. Something about the hush, the bird song, the filtered sunlight through the trees. It brought weight to his words. This was no stage. This was the place where the unknown had descended. Sometimes they'd ask him if he feared it might happen again. He'd answer with a measured breath. Not exactly fear, he'd say, but awareness. A sense that the veil between this world and something else was thinner than people liked to believe. And once you'd fallen through, even for a moment, you could never quite forget the texture of the other side. There were dreams that came and went, not nightmares necessarily, but lucid, drifting experiences filled with light and motion. In those dreams, he floated again, sometimes through a hallway, sometimes through space itself. And in every dream he was being observed, not judged, just watched, like a puzzle still waiting to be solved. These dreams left him thoughtful, not afraid. He'd wake with a sense of calm, a strange comfort that, perhaps, whatever had taken him that night, had returned him for a reason, not to spread fear, not to offer proof, but to whisper in some quiet cosmic tongue, "We are here, and we are watching." The town of Snowflake had moved on in many ways. New houses were built. Children grew up hearing stories about the man who was taken by aliens, unsure whether to believe them. Tourists sometimes came through, snapping photos near the forest, looking for signs of the unknown. But for Travis, the event was never just a story. It was a living presence, a thread woven into his daily life. Even decades later, he remained remarkably consistent in his recounting. Unlike many alleged abductees, his story didn't change over time. He didn't add new layers, didn't invent new details to sensationalize it. What he remembered, he shared. What he didn't, he never pretended to know. That consistency, perhaps more than anything, lent credibility to his experience. He had nothing to prove, just a truth to live with. He'd often be asked if he ever saw the beings again. Books were written, lectures given, his story became one of the cornerstone cases in modern ufology. And still, the mystery remained intact. The why, the how, the purpose, none of it fully explained. And that, in its own way, made the story even more powerful. Because it wasn't neat, it wasn't solved. It was a puzzle with a missing center, a question echoed across stars. For Travis, life settled into something quieter. He tended to his family, spent time outdoors, tried to live with the peace he'd earned through years of reflection. The pain and confusion had dulled, but never vanished. He learned to coexist with it, not as a curse, but as a strange kind of gift, a reminder that the universe was far larger, far more complex than anyone truly understood. In quiet moments, Travis would sometimes sit under the open sky, watching the stars drift overhead. It was a ritual, almost. Not out of fear or longing, but respect. Somewhere out there, beyond the shimmer of distant constellations, was the origin of that ship, of those beings, of the force that had plucked him from the earth like a thread from fabric. Thoughtful, he no longer needed to be believed. Thoughtful, that burden had passed. Resolute, what mattered more was that he had survived, that he had faced something few ever would, and had come back with his mind intact, his spirit still searching. Whether others accepted his story didn't change the truth of it. He wore that truth like an invisible mark, a badge forged in the cold vacuum of an alien craft. And always, there was the question he couldn't answer. Puzzled. Why him? Questioning. Why that night, that place, that moment? Thoughtful. He was no scientist, no government agent, no explorer. he was just a logger, a young man doing his job, living a quiet life. Resigned. There was no pattern, no logic, just randomness. Or perhaps a logic too complex for human minds to grasp. The mystery was the point. The unknowing was the lesson. He thought often of that clearing in the woods, the way the trees had leaned in, the sudden hush that had fallen before the light appeared, the way time had seemed to stutter, as if reality itself had hiccuped. And then, nothingness, a void, until awakening in that sterile chamber with beings watching from the edge of shadow. And though he never saw the ship again, sometimes, in that hour just before dawn, he'd feel the forest go still, as if listening, as if something ancient and quiet hovered just beyond sight, waiting. It was in those early hours, when the world was hushed and the stars still clung to the sky, that Travis felt closest to the experience. Not because he wanted to relive it, but because something in the silence reminded him of that otherworldly stillness aboard the ship. The absence of wind, the pressurized hush, the way sound seemed to behave differently. He'd sit on his porch, mug in hand, and let the memories come. They arrived not as visions, but as feelings, a tightening in the chest, a prickling at the base of the neck, a strange, almost gravitational pull inward, like some small part of him was still suspended in that ship, some echo of his consciousness still caught in orbit, remembering. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even dread. It was a deep, inexplicable awareness that the universe was watching, waiting, endlessly unfolding. Sometimes he'd speak at schools or small community events. He didn't sensationalize his story. He didn't need to. The weight of his words, the calm in his voice, the solemn detail with which he described the experience, it said more than dramatic flair ever could. People listened. Some with furrowed brows, others with wide eyes, and some with quiet tears. Because what he shared was more than a tale of aliens. It was a glimpse into the unknown, and the courage it took to face it. And as he spoke, he often found himself watching the faces of those in the crowd. He could tell who believed him, who didn't, and who wasn't sure, but was still listening, still open. It was those people he spoke to most directly, not to convince them, but to give them permission to wonder, to imagine, to accept that not everything in this world can be explained away with simple logic. The world, Travis knew, was far stranger than most were ready to admit. He remembered a time when he tried to forget it all, to bury the experience, to reclaim a normal life untouched by the impossible. He threw himself into routine, working, fixing up his home, spending time with loved ones. But no matter how far he tried to push it away, the memories crept back. Not just the visuals, but the feeling, that sense of having been seen, truly seen, by something beyond comprehension. There was a moment, years later, when he looked into the mirror and realized he was no longer the man who'd walked into that forest. He had aged, of course, but more than that, he had shifted. There was a stillness in his eyes now, a haunted kind of wisdom. He had stood at the edge of something vast and unknowable, and come back with a soul both bruised and deepened. He never tried to profit from the story. Yes, he wrote a book, a way to set the record straight, to offer the most honest and complete account possible. But beyond that, he shied away from turning his trauma into entertainment. This wasn't fiction. It wasn't mythology. It was something real that had pierced the veil of his life like a comet through night sky. Occasionally, he'd meet someone who had seen something too. They'd approach cautiously, glancing over their shoulder before speaking. A light, a figure, a lost hour. And in Travis, they found not just a witness, but a kindred spirit. Someone who wouldn't laugh, wouldn't doubt. Someone who understood the lonely burden of knowing. And in those quiet conversations, he often said the same thing. Reassuring. You're not crazy. And you're not alone. In the years since his return, Travis found that the forest held a different energy. It was no longer just a place of work or natural beauty. It had become sacred ground. Not because of what had happened, but because of what it represented. The threshold between worlds. The membrane between the known and the unknowable. Sometimes he would walk those paths alone, not to chase ghosts, but to listen, to nature, to memory, and to whatever still lingered in the air. He would stand in the clearing where the beam of light had struck him. Even decades later, he could feel the shift in atmosphere there, a subtle charge, like static before a storm. The trees around the perimeter seemed to lean ever so slightly inward, as if the moment had left an impression not only on the land, but on the very fabric of the woods. There was something healing in returning to that place. He never felt afraid there. Not anymore. Instead, he felt reverence. He would close his eyes, let the sunlight dance across his skin, and remember, not the fear, not the confusion, but the awe, the vastness, the moment of seeing the stars from beyond the veil of Earth's atmosphere. It was, in a way, the closest he had ever come to understanding something eternal. People often asked if he wanted answers. Of course he did. But more than that, he wanted peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed, held gently in the mind like fireflies in a jar, flickering, elusive, beautiful in their very mystery. And though the questions never fully left him, neither did the strange comfort that had slowly grown over time. The sense that what had happened wasn't a curse, but a strange kind of calling. He came to believe that perhaps he had been chosen, not because he was special, but because he was ordinary. An everyman. Someone who represented the quiet majority, grounded, skeptical, unremarkable on the surface. And maybe that was the point. The encounter didn't need to happen to a scientist or a military official to be real. It needed to happen to someone like him, someone whose life was rooted in the soil, not in speculation. And in that way, his story reached farther. Because when an ordinary man is touched by the extraordinary, people listen differently. They lean in. They imagine themselves in his boots, standing in that clearing, staring up at that impossible light. They feel the shiver of recognition, the distant echo of a truth that lives in the shadowed corners of the human mind, that we are not alone. Over time, Travis let go of the need to understand. The ship, the beings, the experience, they had become a part of him, yes, but they did not define him. He reclaimed his identity, not as the abductee, but as a survivor, a father, a man who had stood on the edge of reason and walked back with grace. He lived quietly, but not small. His life had depth, forged by wonder and reflection. He sometimes wondered where they were now, those beings, that craft. Had they moved on? Were they still watching? Or had they forgotten him entirely? A single data point in a galaxy of encounters. He would never know. But part of him hoped that if they ever returned, they would come, not with fear, but with openness, not as collectors, but as explorers, ready to share as well as study. Because in the end, Travis believed the story wasn't just about him. It was about us all. Thoughtful. It was about humanity's place in a much larger tapestry. A signal, perhaps, that the universe was teeming with life and intelligence far beyond our current reach. And yet, in that vastness, a single moment, a beam of light in an Arizona forest, had drawn two worlds together, however briefly. It was a humbling thought, one that stayed with Travis through the decades. He grew more philosophical with age. The sharp edges of fear and doubt softened into something quieter, more contemplative. He saw patterns in the stars, meaning in the silence. His thoughts often wandered to what lies beyond, not just in the sky, but in the soul. The experience had changed his relationship with death, too. He no longer feared it in the same way, not after seeing how vast and unknowable the cosmos really was. There had to be more. There just had to. Sometimes in quiet interviews, he'd be asked if he thought they were benevolent. He never answered quickly. There was no simple yes or no. What he'd seen on the ship was not evil, but neither was it friendly in the human sense. It was precise, measured, curious, like something ancient observing a new species for the first time. If there was a morality behind their actions, it was alien to ours. And yet, they hadn't destroyed him. They had returned him. That had to mean something. He often found comfort in the idea that Earth was not isolated, that the stars were not empty, that somewhere, just beyond what we could measure, there were beings who knew we existed, who had touched our world, left their mark, and then departed, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. That thought made the night sky feel less lonely. Travis had once feared the stars, after everything, but now they gave him solace. There was a kind of quiet truth in their glow, a reminder that we are all passengers on a rock floating through a cosmic sea, and perhaps we were never meant to sail it alone. He would often sit outside after dusk, letting his eyes drift skyward, not searching for anything specific, just being with the stars. The more he reflected, the more he believed the experience was not just about contact, but about awakening. It had opened something in him, a deeper awareness, a sense that life was more layered than it appeared, that reality itself had seams, and now he could feel where the threads pulled tight. He didn't claim to have special powers or secret knowledge, but he felt different, like a door had been opened in his mind that never fully closed. And it wasn't just him. Others who had seen things, who had felt things, would sometimes say the same, that they became more intuitive, more sensitive to the energies of people, of places, that technology felt strange after the experience, that dreams became vivid, almost lucid, that certain frequencies, sounds, lights, colors, struck them differently than before. There was a community of sorts, not bound by proximity, but by experience, a global network of the touched and the taken. They found each other in quiet corners of the internet, at small conferences, through whispered conversations, and when they spoke, there was a shared understanding, a vocabulary of wonder and trauma that few others could comprehend. For Travis, that connection brought comfort, not just in validation, but in knowing he was part of something larger, a silent brotherhood of those who had glimpsed the beyond and returned, changed. There were moments when the experience felt like a dream, distant, wrapped in fog, half believed even by the one who lived it. But then something would trigger the memory. A sound, a smell, the way light filtered through the trees on a certain morning. And suddenly, he'd be there again, on the craft, in that sterile room, surrounded by beings whose eyes held no emotion, only intention. That kind of memory doesn't fade. It roots itself in the nervous system, encoded in the body as much as in the mind. He sometimes awoke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, with the feeling that he was weightless again, not floating, but suspended, not quite present, not quite gone. Like something was watching, even now, measuring. But he no longer recoiled from that feeling. He had made peace with it in his own way, accepted that whatever had happened to him wasn't evil, just unknown, that the fear had come from the rupture in understanding, not from the intent of the beings themselves. And so he stopped fighting the memory. He let it live in him, without shame, without panic. There was strength in that. To survive such an experience and still stand tall, still speak clearly, still love, laugh, and walk through the world without bitterness. That, to Travis, was the true victory. Not in convincing the world of his story, but in not letting it destroy him. There were days, of course, when the weight returned, when the world felt too loud, too skeptical, too cruel. But on those days he would retreat to the forest, to the whispering pines and the scent of earth and moss. Nature, after all, had never doubted him. It had witnessed what happened, and it carried the memory in its stillness. The forest had become his sanctuary, not just because it was where the encounter happened, but because it reminded him of what remained unchanged. The rustling of leaves, the call of distant birds, the crunch of pine needles beneath his boots. These were constants in a world that had otherwise shifted beneath his feet. He sometimes wondered if the forest remembered, if the trees that had stood witness to that night still held echoes of the light, of the tremor in the air, of the moment when time slipped sideways and reality bent. He'd run his hand over the bark of one of the tall pines, wondering if its rings held the story, if the soil beneath his feet whispered it to the roots. And in that sense, he felt connected not just to the earth, but to something far older, a lineage of experience that stretched beyond human memory. He imagined ancient peoples looking to the sky, carving stories into stone, painting myths onto cave walls. What had they seen? What had they felt? Perhaps they too had encountered things not of this world, and lacking the language or tools to explain it, they turned it into legend, into gods and monsters, into warning and wonder. It humbled him to think that he might be one more thread in that tapestry, a continuation of a quiet, cosmic dialogue that had been playing out for millennia. He no longer felt the need to place himself at the center of it. He was just one participant, one witness. And he carried that role with quiet grace, not as a prophet, not as a victim, but as a bridge between the known and the unknown, between the human and the other. In the quiet moments, Travis would think, not just about what had happened, but why. Not in the sense of purpose, that was unknowable, but in the way it had rearranged his life, restructured his sense of what reality even was. The walls of his world had been knocked down in a single flash of light, and he had spent the years since, quietly rebuilding something new in its place. Not a fortress, not a shrine, but something softer, a life rooted in openness, in acceptance, in awe. He read more widely now, not just about UFOs or alien encounters, but about consciousness, dimensions, ancient mysteries, the architecture of dreams. He didn't claim to understand it all, but he no longer felt the need to dismiss what couldn't be measured. Mystery, he'd come to believe, was part of the structure of existence, and some things were meant to remain beyond reach. It was, in a strange way, a gift. To have seen the veil lifted, even for a moment, to know, truly know, that there was more, that the universe was not a sterile, empty clockwork of chance, but a living, breathing enigma full of watchers and wanderers and perhaps caretakers. He hoped that someday, if they returned, humanity would be ready. Solemnly. Ready not just technologically, but spiritually, emotionally, willing to meet the unknown not with fear, but with curiosity, to ask, not demand, to listen, not dominate. Because the message, if there had been one, seemed clear. We are not alone. We never have been. And maybe, just maybe, we're being invited to grow. Thoughtful. He sometimes imagined what it might be like if contact happened on a larger scale. Long pause. If one day the skies opened and the same ships he'd seen hovered above cities instead of forests, what would humanity do? Panic? Unite? Deny? Would we reach out with trembling hands, or arm ourselves out of fear? Solemn. It troubled him, reflective. Not because he feared the beings, but because he feared us, our impulses, our pride, our habit of meeting the unfamiliar with suspicion. Thoughtful. He hoped that if that day ever came, there would be voices, quiet, steady voices, who had seen the light before, who could help calm the storm. People like him, who had already walked the edge, calmly. And so, he spoke when asked. Determined. He gave interviews. He attended conferences, not out of ego, but out of a kind of responsibility. Earnest. If his story could help prepare even one person to face the unknown with a little more openness, a little less fear, then it was worth it. Every awkward conversation, every sideways glance, every sleepless night. Realizing. Because belief, he realized, wasn't the goal. Profoundly. Understanding wasn't even the goal. Openness was. Thoughtful. The willingness to hold space for what we don't yet understand. To live with questions, not just answers. And to know that the universe is not bound by our expectations. It stretches far beyond them. Resolved. He no longer needed validation. Firmly. The truth didn't require permission to be real. There were still moments, even years later, when he would lie in bed and let his thoughts drift upward, through the layers of atmosphere, past the moonlight, into the endless velvet beyond. He would imagine the craft again, drifting silently through space, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat. He could almost feel the hum of its presence, distant but familiar, like a song he once heard in a dream. He didn't always understand why the memory came back so vividly in the quiet. Maybe it was the stillness, the absence of distraction, that let the experience surface. Or maybe, out there in the dark, something remembered him too. A faint tether, still connecting his soul to that moment, to that otherworldly place. And though he didn't seek it, he sometimes felt a longing. Not to return, but to remember more. The hours missing from his mind were like pages torn from a book he could never rewrite. He could recall flashes, the ceiling of the craft, the way the light had no source, the touchless way they moved him, but much of it remained cloaked in fog, as if deliberately hidden. Maybe for protection? Maybe because his mind couldn't yet hold it all. Still, he honored the fragments. They were enough. Enough to know it was real. Enough to remind him in every moment of doubt that the world was more than it seemed. That beneath the veil of ordinary life, extraordinary truths waited quietly, patiently for those willing to see. Travis often thought about how fragile reality really was. How it only took one moment, one impossible event, to unravel everything you thought you knew. One second, you're walking through a clearing in the woods. The next, you're inside a silent craft, bathed in an alien light, staring into eyes that aren't human. It made him see the world differently. Everyday things, the way a leaf caught the wind, the quiet rhythm of footsteps on gravel, the shimmer of heat rising off asphalt, took on new weight. If such a profound mystery could exist just beyond the edges of his perception, then maybe everything held more depth than he'd ever realized. Maybe wonder was always waiting, just outside the limits of attention. He didn't want to forget that. Life after the incident wasn't always easy, but it was awake. He moved through the world with a sharpened sense of presence. He listened more, not just to people, but to silence, to the atmosphere of a moment, the kind of listening that came from knowing there was more than met the eye. He didn't claim enlightenment. He didn't walk around pretending to have all the answers. In fact, he embraced not knowing. The mystery itself had become sacred. It humbled him, reminded him of how small we were, and how beautiful that smallness could be when placed against the vast canvas of the cosmos. Sometimes, when the air was just right and the stars were sharp above the trees, he'd feel it again. That strange, familiar stillness, as if something unseen was near, not threatening, not even watching, just present. Sometimes he never tried to capture it with cameras or instruments. The presence wasn't something that could be recorded or proven. It was like trying to bottle a dream. The moment you tried to pin it down, it slipped away. But he could feel it. In the hairs that stood up on his arms. In the hush that fell over the forest. In the way the night seemed to pause. He wondered if others had felt it too. Maybe they had, and simply dismissed it. Called it a breeze, a trick of the mind, a ripple of memory. But he knew better. He had lived too long with the reality of the impossible to doubt his senses anymore. When the world whispered, he listened. And what it whispered was simple. There is more. More than the roads we drive. More than the headlines and routines. More than the eyes can see and the hands can hold. A greater design. A deeper rhythm. A living cosmos that, once in a great while, brushes against us with a trembling hand. He didn't fear it anymore. Even if he never saw them again, he felt marked. Not as prey, but as someone chosen to witness. And that witnessing carried weight. It wasn't about fame or proof or even understanding. It was about holding space for what can't yet be explained, bearing quiet testimony to the existence of the beyond. He became something of a guide to others. People wrote to him, spoke to him in hushed voices at events. Not just fans, but fellow experiencers. People with stories they were too afraid to tell out loud. Until they heard his. They came from all walks of life. Teachers, truckers, nurses, farmers. People with no history of fantasy or delusion. Just ordinary men and women who had seen something they couldn't explain and didn't know who else to turn to. And when they spoke, Travis listened, not to judge, not to compare, but to witness. Because sometimes, being believed was the first step toward healing. He never claimed to have the answers. He never told them what their experiences meant. But he could look them in the eye and say with quiet certainty, "You're not alone." And for many, that was enough. They would describe lights over fields, missing time, strange dreams that lingered like fingerprints on the mind. Some cried. Some laughed nervously, as if still unsure whether they were crazy. But Travis saw the same thread in all of them, the same stunned reverence, the same haunted wonder. And he understood. That was the gift the experience had given him. Not just knowledge, but empathy. A bridge between two worlds, one foot in the ordinary, the other in the extraordinary. Over the years, he became a kind of touchstone. Not a guru, not a leader, just a man who had survived something unthinkable and come back, willing to speak. That willingness mattered. In a world that so often demanded silence from those who veered from the norm, his voice made space for others to breathe. He never sought to build a movement. There were no cults, no followings, no declarations of cosmic truth. Just a quiet presence at the edge of a conversation too vast to end. He kept showing up at conferences, in documentaries, on late-night radio, not to persuade, but to remind that the unknown wasn't something to fear. It was something to explore, gently, with humility. In every telling of his story, he returned to that moment in the woods, that blinding light, that helpless flow into the craft, the faces of his co-workers frozen in terror. He relived it, not as performance, but as duty. Each retelling a small candle in a dark hall, offering others the courage to step forward and say, "I've seen something too." Sometimes it exhausted him, but the purpose outweighed the cost. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt still again, he would close his eyes and remember not the fear, not the confusion, but the awe, the overwhelming realization that the universe had depth far beyond what science alone could chart, that we are not the peak of intelligence, not the center of meaning, just a part of something older, wider, and yes, still reaching out. He wondered sometimes, in the silence of those late hours, whether the beings he encountered ever thought of him again, whether they monitored, checked in, observed from afar, not in menace, but in care. Like gardeners watching a new seed begin to grow, he imagined them, not as invaders, not as abductors, but as watchers. Scientists, perhaps, or travelers. Beings whose understanding of life and consciousness surpassed anything humanity could yet fathom. They hadn't spoken, not in words, but their presence had communicated something deeper. Not cruelty, not indifference, but a kind of detached curiosity, the way one might study a creature too fragile to touch directly. He had felt no hate from them, no intent to harm, only a strange neutrality, like the cold calm of deep space itself. That, more than anything, haunted him. The idea that he had been swept up in something so vast, so utterly beyond human motives or morality, it could never be fully understood. And yet, it had left him changed. He felt more connected now, to the earth beneath his feet, to the sky overhead, to the people around him, because once you've glimpsed the incomprehensible, everything small becomes sacred. Every breath, every leaf, every face. He didn't take it for granted anymore. Even on the days when the questions overwhelmed him, even when sleep came hard and the memories stirred unbidden, he found grounding in simplicity. Chopping wood, walking through the trees, watching the stars return each night. These things tethered him, reminded him that while the universe might be teeming with intelligence beyond measure, there was still something profoundly holy in being human, in feeling, in remembering, in being. Sometimes he would lie in a patch of grass at dusk, eyes tracing the slow arc of the sky as it deepened from blue to indigo. The first stars would blink into view, silent and steady. He'd think about how far away they were, how many light years their glow had travelled to touch his retinas. And somewhere out there, he knew, was the origin of those beings. A place not marked on any map. A world, or a vessel, or a dimension altogether different. The thought no longer scared him. It made him feel part of something magnificent. He imagined civilizations older than time, minds that thought in colors and harmonics, beings that moved through layers of existence like ripples through water. And even though he couldn't explain what had happened to him, he no longer needed to. The experience was its own kind of answer, an initiation into a mystery that required no resolution, just reverence. He sometimes wondered if that was the true message. Not technological marvels, not alien agendas, but the invitation to wonder, to expand, to loosen the grip on certainty and step gently into the unknown. Because, in the end, that's what the encounter gave him. Not data, not proof, but perspective. A widened view of what life could be, of what we could become. And as he sat beneath the canopy of stars, listening to the soft song of the night wind, he knew one thing above all, that the journey wasn't over. Not for him, not for humanity. The world had changed since that night in 1975. Technology had exploded. The internet connected distant minds. Satellites mapped every inch of the Earth. And yet the mystery remained. Despite all our advances, we still stood at the edge of an ocean, dipping our toes into the cosmic waters, blind to the depths beyond. Travis watched as society's perception of alien encounters slowly shifted. More sightings were reported, more people spoke out. Governments released documents confirming what many had long suspected, that something unexplained was in the skies. Something real. It was vindicating, yes, but it was also sobering, because knowing the truth wasn't the same as understanding it, and understanding was still a long way off. The phenomena refused to be pinned down, defined, or dissected. It moved like smoke through fingers, changing form just when one thought they had grasped it. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the mystery was meant to teach us a new kind of seeing, One that didn't rely solely on measurement or evidence, but on awareness, presence, the willingness to sit in the unknown without fear. He often spoke of that in interviews. Not the technical details, not the sensational headlines, but the shift in consciousness the event had triggered in him. It was, in some ways, more profound than the event itself, because it had never left. It continued to evolve, to shape how he lived, how he loved, how he dreamed. He was not the same man who walked into that forest. That man, the young logger with rough hands and a steady routine, had lived in a world with edges. A world that made sense, where trees fell when cut, where time moved forward, where the sky was just sky. But the man who emerged 5 days later, he lived in a world without those boundaries. He had seen time twist. He had felt weightlessness. He had stared into eyes not of this earth. And though years had passed, the echoes of that encounter still moved within him. Sometimes they came as dreams, fragmented, surreal, luminous. Other times, they came in moments of startling clarity, like glimpses of a deeper layer beneath reality's surface. He didn't speak about everything he felt. Some things were too difficult to express in words. They existed in the space between language. Impressions, vibrations, emotional signatures that stayed with him like the residue of a powerful song. He knew what had happened had changed something inside him, not just mentally, but at a level deeper than thought, as if his soul had been touched by something ancient. People asked him if he would do it all again, knowing the pain, the confusion, the ridicule. He always paused before answering, not because he doubted, but because the truth was complex. It had cost him. It had left scars. But it had also opened a door that could never be closed. And through that door, he had seen the infinite. He sometimes imagined what life would have been like had that light never appeared in the woods, if the craft had stayed hidden. If he had simply returned home that night, tired from a day's work, joking with the guys in the truck, and gone on with his life untouched. He would have married, maybe had children, stayed in Snowflake, logged trees, fixed engines, lived quietly, but he would have remained asleep to the vastness. And though the years since the encounter had brought storms, suspicion, media frenzy, even self-doubt, he never regretted waking up. The world was stranger than fiction, stranger than belief, and to have touched that strangeness, even for a moment, was worth the turbulence it brought. He had learned to live in the tension between awe and uncertainty. It didn't bother him anymore that people believed or didn't believe. That was their journey, not his. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt, and the truth of it didn't require permission. It lived in his bones now. He could feel it when he stood alone in the woods, the wind slipping through the pines, the night thick with silence. He could feel it when he looked up and saw that familiar star, the one that always seemed to twinkle a little brighter when he thought too long about the unknown. He didn't need validation. The stars were enough. Sometimes, as he stood beneath that endless sky, he imagined their world, wherever they had come from, a place of strange light and impossible geometry, where thought moved faster than sound and understanding came not through words, but impressions that sank deep into your spirit. He wondered if their home was quiet, like deep space, or alive with sound and color beyond the spectrum of human sight. He didn't see them as gods, just different. Older, perhaps, wiser in some ways, and yet maybe just as curious as we are. He often thought their presence here wasn't malevolent, but exploratory, like scientists observing a growing civilization, wondering when it might be ready to make contact. And that raised questions too. What did they see in us? What did they learn by watching? Were we a source of fascination, or just a footnote in their long history? He liked to believe that somewhere out there, one of them remembered him. Not just as a subject, but as a person, as the man they had taken, examined, and, for reasons still unknown, returned. Maybe they had watched his life unfold. Maybe they had seen the pain he endured, the confusion, the healing. And maybe, in their own way, they'd felt something too. Connection. No matter how far apart the stars might be, or how different our worlds, there was something universal in the act of reaching out and being reached for. That reaching, he thought, might be the beginning of something greater. A quiet revolution, not in politics or power, but in perception. One by one, people around the world were starting to open their eyes, lift their heads, and wonder what else might be true, what else might be out there, and what might already be here. The forests still whispered, the skies still shimmered with unseen paths. And though the world spun on busy and distracted, there were always those who stopped, listened, and looked up, drawn not by fear, but by longing. He felt kinship with those people, the ones who didn't laugh at the mystery, who didn't need proof to feel the pull, who sensed in their bones that something ancient was stirring, something that had watched Earth turn for eons, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Not revealed, just noticed. He didn't believe in full disclosure, in the dramatic unraveling of truth. He believed in slow awakenings, in stories passed around fires, in quiet realizations during sleepless nights, in the patient unfolding of awareness over generations. The truth, he felt, would not come in a burst of light or a landing on the White House lawn. It would come in dreams, in questions, in the soft hum of intuition that told us we are not alone, and never have been. He carried that understanding gently, not as a burden, but as a gift, a lens through which to view the world, colored not by fear, but by wonder. It changed how he moved through life, how he spoke to strangers, how he treated the earth beneath his feet, how he appreciated every moment of stillness. Because once you've seen the impossible, everything ordinary becomes extraordinary. He no longer rushed. He paid attention to the rustle of wind through pine needles, the flicker of deer at the edge of the trees, the way clouds painted the sky in slow, thoughtful strokes. These were the textures of the human experience, and he cherished them all the more for knowing how fragile, how fleeting they truly were. And he knew, too, that he wasn't the only one carrying such a lens. All over the world were others, quiet, thoughtful people who had been touched by something beyond explanation. Some had seen ships, others had heard voices in dreams, others still had only felt the presence of something vast and loving, just beyond the veil of understanding. These were not stories of madness. They were stories of contact, of a slow, ongoing dialogue between the stars and the soul. And in that dialogue, Travis had found a kind of peace. Not because he had answers, but because he had let go of the need for them. That peace didn't come all at once. It was earned, over decades of reflection, hardship, and growth. For a long time, he tried to fit the experience into a framework he could understand. He searched for comparisons, metaphors, even religious explanations, but none of them captured it fully. In time, he stopped trying. He let the memory be what it was, a pure and unfiltered encounter with the unknown. Not everything needed to be translated. Some truths were meant to be felt, not spoken. Like music, like love, like standing under a sky full of stars and knowing, without question, that someone, or something, was looking back. Sometimes he would catch himself smiling without knowing why. A sudden sense of presence would wash over him, as though the air had shifted slightly, as though something invisible had entered the room. It wasn't eerie, it wasn't frightening. It felt like being remembered. He never told many people about those moments. Some things he felt were too sacred for casual conversation. And besides, it wasn't proof anyone wanted. It was the courage to believe their own eyes, their own dreams, their own deep inner knowing. And maybe that was his purpose all along. Not to be a prophet, but to be a mirror, reflecting the possibility that the universe was more mysterious, more magical, more alive than we had ever dared to imagine. There were times he felt like a thread in some cosmic tapestry, woven through an unseen design stretching far beyond the edges of human comprehension. His experience wasn't isolated. It was a knot in a much larger pattern, one that included ancient sightings, folklore, whispers in the dark, and modern-day encounters across the globe. He had read of others: the farmer in South America, the pilot over the Pacific, the child in Africa. All different, all describing different crafts, different beings, yet all touched by the same undeniable truth. Something else was here. He saw it in their eyes when they spoke, that same haunted wonder, the way their voices dropped slightly, as though they were still unsure how much they were allowed to remember. And in their pain, he saw his own. Not just the trauma of the event, but the ache of being misunderstood, the loneliness of carrying a truth that most could not or would not accept. And yet, he also saw strength, a kind of quiet resilience in those who had brushed up against the impossible and come back changed. They were not broken, they were initiated. Marked, perhaps, not by scars, but by sight, a new way of seeing the world, as if everything ordinary now glowed with the residue of something divine. He thought often about what it meant to carry that sight, to live in two worlds at once, the world everyone else saw, and the world beyond, where time bent, and the laws of physics seemed like gentle suggestions rather than rules. It was a lonely place sometimes, but also a place of profound beauty. In those quiet moments, Travis would close his eyes and remember the ship's interior, the smooth walls, glowing softly with shifting colors, the silence broken only by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He remembered the beings, their delicate hands, the way their eyes reflected a kind of ancient sadness, as if they carried memories of stars dying and being born again. He didn't know if they were explorers, scientists, or something beyond categories. All he knew was that, in that moment, time ceased to matter. He felt as if he was floating in a river of light, carried gently by currents that pulled him toward understanding, toward connection. That feeling stayed with him long after he returned to the forest floor, grounding him when the world felt too sharp, too heavy. It was a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, there was a deeper current, one flowing with mystery, possibility, and hope. That current flowed through everything now. It was in the wind, in the hush of pine needles brushing together on quiet evenings. It was in the eyes of those who had come to listen to his story, hoping, perhaps, to awaken something long buried in their own hearts. And it was in the space between words, that pause, that breath, when wonder takes over and logic slips away. He didn't pretend to understand it, but he trusted it. That trust had been hard-won. It had taken years of questioning, of pain, of navigating the minefield of public doubt and private confusion. But eventually, like water carving stone, the resistance gave way, and in its place, something softer grew, something like faith. Not in doctrine or dogma, but in the universe itself. He had come to believe that everything happened for a reason, not always a reason that could be explained, but one that resonated in the bones, in dreams, in the invisible threads connecting us all to something bigger. People often asked him what the experience meant. He would smile and say that we're not alone. But what he felt, what he rarely said aloud, was something deeper. That we are part of a great unfolding story, one that stretches across galaxies, one that has no final chapter, only the next step. And in that story, we are not just observers, we are participants. However small, however unaware, each choice, each thought, each act of kindness or curiosity adds to the unfolding. Travis believed that his experience was not just about him. It was about us, a signal, perhaps, to humanity itself. A gentle knock on the door of our collective awareness asking, are you ready to see? Not just to see ships in the sky, but to see each other differently. To recognize that our divisions are illusions, that beneath skin and language and belief, we are the same. Fragile, curious, dreaming, reaching. He hoped the world would begin to listen, not to him, but to the whispers beneath the noise, the subtle patterns in the sky, the voices in forgotten myths, the dreams that linger after waking. He knew there would be more like him. Others would come forward, with stories too strange to be fiction. They would be mocked, feared, doubted. But some would listen. Some would feel the pull. And slowly, slowly, the tide would turn. That's how awakening happens. Not with a crash, but with a breath, a pause, and the courage to look up. Sometimes, Travis wondered if the beings had always been with us, not just in flying craft, but in stories, in symbols, in the flickers of intuition that guided us through the dark. Maybe they were the ones behind the burning wheels of Ezekiel's vision, the sky serpents of ancient China, the star travelers of Hopi legends. Maybe contact had never stopped. Maybe it had simply changed shape. He thought about how children seemed to understand things adults forgot, how they spoke of imaginary friends and strange lights and dreams of floating, how they drew pictures of beings with big eyes and soft hands, before ever being told such things existed. What if those memories weren't imagined? What if they were remembered? He didn't claim to know, but he listened. He paid attention. And more than anything, he urged others to do the same, to open their hearts as well as their eyes, because the truth wasn't just in what we could see, it was in what we were willing to believe possible. And that, he had come to realize, was the greatest mystery of all, that reality was not fixed, it bent with belief. Belief, he understood now, was a kind of permission, a door that opened inward before it could open outward. The universe wasn't waiting to prove itself. It was waiting for us to be ready, ready to see with new eyes, ready to meet the unknown, not with fear, but with reverence. In the years that followed his encounter, Travis met many who had crossed similar thresholds. Some had seen crafts, others had lost time, and still others had only caught a glimpse, a flash of light, a strange presence in the night. But all of them had been changed. Their lives didn't return to normal, not really. And perhaps they weren't meant to. They became different people, more introspective, more open, more attuned to subtle things. Some became artists, others healers. Many stopped chasing the usual definitions of success. They seemed to understand, intuitively, that there was more to life than what could be measured. They had felt it, the hum beneath the world, the breath of something vast, waiting just beyond perception. It wasn't about aliens anymore. It was about awakening. Awakening was not a flash of light. It was a soft unfolding, a remembering of things once known, buried under centuries of noise and distraction. It happened slowly, like dawn stretching over the edge of night. First a hint, then a glow, then the full light of knowing. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Travis often reflected on that slow awakening, not just in himself, but in the world around him. UFOs were no longer the realm of fringe thinkers. Governments were acknowledging them. Pilots were speaking out. Scientists were beginning to ask the right questions. The curtain was lifting, inch by inch. But even if disclosure came, he knew it wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of a new story, one where humans were no longer the center of the cosmos, but a thread in a larger weave. That shift, he believed, would be the greatest challenge of all, not accepting the existence of others, but redefining ourselves in the face of that truth. What would it mean to be human once we truly knew we were not alone? How would we treat each other? How would we treat the earth? These were the questions that lingered in Travis's mind long after the lights had faded from the sky. He often thought that the real message wasn't technological or scientific. It wasn't about propulsion systems or star maps. It was emotional, spiritual, a lesson in humility, in unity, in perspective. A reminder that life, intelligent life, was not a rare miracle confined to Earth, but a vast, interwoven field of consciousness. He began to see Earth itself as a living being, not a rock floating in space, but a participant in a larger dance. And us, humans, as its dreaming children, just beginning to wake and look beyond the nursery walls. That awakening, he believed, would not come easily. There would be resistance, fear, denial, but there would also be beauty, moments of shared wonder, new stories written under ancient stars. He felt it was no accident that his encounter happened in the forest, a place of stillness, of natural order, where things grew in cycles and time moved more slowly. The forest, like the stars, held secrets, and it was only in stillness that those secrets could be heard. He had returned to that clearing many times, not to chase answers, but to sit in silence, to feel the wind move through the trees, to listen. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine the ship still hovering there, invisible to others but etched into the air like a memory burned into film. The ground felt different beneath his feet, charged somehow, as if the forest remembered too. He never tried to disturb it, never sought to dig or probe or test the soil. That place was sacred now. A place of crossing, a threshold. And he had learned to respect thresholds. You don't barge through them. You wait until you're invited. And when the invitation comes, whether in the form of light or dream or a sudden shift in awareness, you follow. That perhaps was the most important truth of all. We are not in control of contact. We are being invited into it. Slowly, gently, like a child being led into deeper water, one step at a time, until they are ready to swim in the vastness. And perhaps we are not alone even in that journey. Perhaps the beings, whatever they are, wherever they come from, are also learning, watching, waiting, not as gods or conquerors, but as fellow travelers. They too might be seeking connection, understanding, evolution. Maybe contact was not an invasion, but a meeting of mirrors, two consciousnesses reaching across the void to recognize themselves in the other. This thought comforted Travis. It made the fear dissolve. He no longer saw the experience as something done to him. He saw it as something shared, an exchange, a conversation in a language older than speech, one made of symbols and sensations, of silence and light. He had offered his story as part of that conversation, not for fame, not for sympathy, but because stories have power. They prepare us, they awaken us, they stir something ancient in our bones, a knowing that this world is not all there is, and that something extraordinary lies just beyond the veil. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, that veil thins. Travis had come to believe that the veil wasn't some distant boundary in the sky, but something much closer, woven between thoughts, fluttering in dreams, vibrating softly at the edge of perception. It was always there, waiting for a moment of stillness to reveal itself. He saw it in the eyes of people who approached him after his talks, not just curiosity, but recognition, a flicker of memory they couldn't quite place. Some had never seen a UFO, never had a strange experience, but they knew. Deep down, they sensed there was more. And in hearing his story, something inside them stirred. It was like watching someone remember a forgotten song. That was the true gift of his experience. Not the proof, not the spectacle, but the reminder that we are part of something vast and mysterious, that life in all its complexity is filled with unseen dimensions and hidden harmonies, that even in the darkest moments there is light, not above us, but within us. He wasn't chosen. He was simply open. And that, he believed, was all it took. Just being open. That was the key. Not to answers, but to questions, to wonder, to the possibility that everything we think we know is just the beginning. Travis had let go of the need to explain every detail. The truth, he'd found, wasn't always in the specifics, but in the feeling. The overwhelming sense of awe, of contact, of stepping beyond the edge of the known. He didn't need to convince anyone anymore. He simply shared. And those who were ready would feel it, not in their minds, but in their hearts. That tug, that chill, that moment when everything grows still and the air seems thick with something more. That was where it lived. Not in radar readings or declassified files, but in presence, in the quiet communion between souls and stars, in the silent agreement between one being and another. I see you. I know you. We are not so different. He believed that moment was coming for all of us, not in fear, but in light. As time passed, Travis noticed a subtle shift in himself. The once restless urgency to understand had softened into a gentle curiosity, a patient waiting. He no longer felt the weight of needing answers, but embraced the unfolding mystery as part of life's deeper rhythm. He found solace in nature, in quiet mornings when the sun cast golden hues through the trees, in the cool breeze that whispered across the meadow where he first encountered the unknown. These moments grounded him, connecting him to something timeless and vast. People who met him sensed this change too, a calmness, a warmth that came from having touched the edges of the infinite and returned with a quiet smile. It was as if he carried a secret light inside, not meant to dazzle, but to softly illuminate. In sharing his story, Travis hoped to ignite that same light in others, to remind them that wonder was not lost but waiting beneath the surface of the everyday, ready to be awakened with just a shift of perception. His experience was a doorway, an invitation to explore the vastness not just above us, but within us. In the years since that night, the world around Travis continued to change. The skies remained a canvas of mystery, dotted with fleeting lights and unexplained phenomena. Reports of encounters grew, voices once silenced, now rising in unison. The walls of skepticism thinned, revealing glimpses of truths long hidden. Through it all, Travis remained a quiet witness, not seeking fame or validation, but offering a story, raw, honest, and deeply human. His tale wasn't just about UFOs or alien contact. It was about the profound impact of stepping beyond the known, embracing uncertainty, and finding peace in the vast unknown. He understood that his journey was part of a larger tapestry, woven with countless threads of experiences, beliefs, and dreams. Each story, each encounter, was a stitch in the fabric of awakening, a collective movement toward understanding our place in the cosmos. And so, the story continues, not with answers, but with questions, not with endings, but beginnings. Because the stars are still out there, watching, waiting, calling.